evening. Welcome to another edition of Cavanaugh's Corner, the labor talk show in southern Maine on public access television. I'm Mike Cavanaugh, and we're in the offices of the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union in Biddeford, and I'm joined this evening by my guest, Kit St. John. Kit is the new executive director of the Maine Center for Economic Policy located in Augusta, and want to welcome you to join us this evening, Kit.
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure.
What we want to talk with our viewers about, now this show is being aired around Maine in December, maybe early January. It's the beginning of a new legislature. Kit, you've spent a lot of years working 12, only seems like
longer,
right?
Yes.
Working in Augusta at the legislature, and in your new role as the director of the Maine Center for Economic Policy, as I understand, and I'd like you to explain a bit to our viewers, you're going to be having the opportunity to try to help influence some of the debate and provide some alternatives for the debate that will be going on about our state budget and the decisions that the governor and the legislature need to make about taxes and spending. And I think that's really what we want to focus on in this show from the point of view of how is this going to impact working people. We all went through the political election season. We heard candidates pledging not to raise our taxes or to cut our taxes or to do wonderful things for us. And now the question is going to be, what are they going to do to us? So maybe, Kit, if you could sort of begin by describing a little bit about what is the Maine Center for Economic Policy, how is it that you guys are going to try to assist in this process?
The Maine Center for Economic Policy was started last year, and it grew out of an effort that many Maine organizations, total 30, that included the Maine AFL-CIO, Maine Women's Lobby, Maine Council of Churches, Maine People's Alliance, Maine Association for Interdependent Neighborhoods, and 25 other organizations in a coalition called Taxpayers for a Fair Budget that emerged to try to influence the debate in the last 4 years of budget crises. And this group was invited by the Ford Foundation to apply as one of 38 states organizations that were invited to apply to the Ford Foundation for funds to do what Ford calls state fiscal policy analysis. And the foundation's point of view was that what they call vulnerable populations have suffered disproportionately in these years of fiscal crisis, not just in Maine, but in most states. There have been very difficult years for state government. And as state government has retrenched and cut back, suffered a loss of resources compared to its growth in expenses, programs that benefit the mentally ill, developmentally disabled, people in nursing homes, those kinds of programs have shrunk and suffered. So they invited us to apply, and we were successful in that competition, one of 11 states funded, to develop information and make it available to the public and to legislators and to the governor, with the hope that better information could lead to better decisions, that we could point out ways in which current spending patterns may be inefficient or penny wise and pound foolish, that we are getting ourselves into short-run fixes that really are going to cost us a lot more money in the long run. And the idea of no new taxes, as one example, sort of turns people away from really looking at who is paying what taxes. And one of the issues that we want to address is this whole question of tax loopholes and tax breaks, that some people are being excused from carrying their burden of state government, and that necessarily puts a greater burden on those who are paying.
Okay, so the organization and you as the director are trying to bring to bear on the new legislature some alternative views of how it is that we're raising our money and how it is that we're spending our money. I think as I've had an opportunity in the last couple of days to look at some of the work that the Maine Center has is just about to release, and that we're, I guess, the 15th of this month, you're going to be releasing your first report, a compendium
Yes.
of articles. And I think that there are things that you're going to be talking about here that your contributing authors talk about that really weren't talked about in the political election season. There's people who spent time watching shows other than Cavanaugh's Corner saw a lot of television advertisements in the election cycle that revolved around, slogans like "no new taxes" and the like. But I think life is a little bit more complicated than that, and that's, at least in the initial look, those are the kinds of issues that you're looking at. I wonder, Kit, if you might just describe for our viewers how your, well, tell us about the book a little bit, but
Yes.
then sort of the opening section of your book,
Yes.
which I found to be sort of a very understandable and illuminating example
Yeah.
to talk about.
Well, I've spent 6 months working with the authors who contributed chapters to this book since July, and learned that there's a lot more to putting out such a book than just asking somebody to write a chapter.
Mm-hmm.
So it's taken some time. And I enjoyed, as you have described, enjoying the introduction that Frank O'Hara wrote.
Mm-hmm.
Frank used to be on the staff of the State Planning Office, and now is in a firm called Market Decisions that does polling and other market-related research. And he suggests that as we begin to think about the state budget, we imagine we had a friend named Harry who had the idea of going out to buy a book, and the way he approached that was not to decide what book did he want, but to simply go to the store and say, I've got $15, pick me a book.
Mm-hmm.
And then he went to the grocery store, and rather than having his grocery list of the particular things he wanted to buy, he handed a $20 bill to the cashier and said, pick me some groceries. And the point that Frank makes in this somewhat amusing way is that state government really acts in some way like Harry. That is, no new taxes means $1.6 billion, which is what the state took in taxes last year, is exactly the right amount to spend, no matter what we need. And as Frank points out, it might be that there would be a program in state government that would make a tremendous difference to us, our communities, and our children, that might cost, let's say, a few $1 million more than $1.6 billion. But we'll never touch it. We won't look at it. We won't consider it if we start our investigation with the idea of no new taxes.
Mm-hmm.
Or, as he points out, some programs in state government may be kept going beyond their usefulness because they were there last year.
Mm-hmm.
And we tend to just say, well, whatever was there last year, we should continue without really going back to the beginning to say, what do we need?
Mm-hmm.
And it's an amusing way to introduce a book that, as he describes in that introduction, it's heavy going.
Mm-hmm.
It's complicated subjects, and most people don't have the time to kind of dig into state government. And so, as you described, we tend to discuss state government finance in the kind of slogans that were used in a political campaign.
Mm-hmm.
But when we actually have to make the hard decisions about how to spend the state dollars to buy the things that the state has traditionally done, slogans are not good enough.
Right.
We've got to look at things more carefully.
Right. Well, as we said, the legislature is about to open its session, and they will be, no one knows for certain what's going to happen. Everybody knows we have a unique situation with essentially an even number of Democrats and Republicans and independent as the governor, and so it's not quite clear where the power might be. But the one thing that everyone does seem to agree on is that when the legislature opens, there will soon be a budget crisis of some $200, $300, $400 million, very sizable money.
Yes.
in the case of a state the size of Maine. And so very quickly, the slogans from the election campaign, all of those things that working people were asked to make decisions about in terms of who do they vote for, are now going to have to get sharpened up into very particular decisions, hard decisions that are going to have to be made by the legislature and the governor. And we're starting from the point of saying, no new taxes and no more budget gimmicks. That is going to sort of mean that then we're going to have to make some very hard choices and cut some significant dollars from the existing programs.
Let me take a particular example to illustrate what I regard as the inadequacy of some of the slogans. One of the slogans is, well, we should just cut across the board. And if you stop and think about the functions of state government, you quickly realize that what the state legislature can limit is actually a very small piece of the state budget. Let me give the examples. 40% of the state budget goes to aid to local education. The legislature does not say very much about how those dollars are spent. They just send it out by a formula to municipalities. It's spent on the local level. Now, of course, that could be cut 15%, but it has already been constrained. In the last 4 years, it's been kept essentially level for 4 years, essentially frozen, went from roughly $513 million to $516 million, something like that over 4 years. That has had consequences already. That is, the poorer districts in the state have had to raise property taxes and also had to cut teachers, fire teachers, some of whom had just been added in the 10 years previous as part of the educational reform. So that's an example where the idea of, quote, no new taxes actually would have the effect, if it were carried out in an across-the-board cut, cutting 15% out of the money that the state provides to local education. In some communities, there would be very substantial property tax increases. In other communities, they could probably get by without such a substantial property tax increase. So what it introduces is both some real harm to the education of the kids in those poorer districts and considerable unfairness, that some property taxpayers will be burdened much greater than other property taxpayers. So that's an example of how the slogans break down. But we could talk about some other areas.
Well, I think that you hit on the idea of taxes, and I think what many people saw and heard during the campaign season was various candidates who pledged to either outdo each other in terms of how they were going to provide tax relief, holding the line against the appetite of government for more and more taxes. And these are slogans that all sound very good to people. Most people are, at least most people that I know and that I work with, and I think this is true around the state of Maine, are struggling to make ends meet, and they have jobs. If they have jobs, they don't feel very secure about them. The income of those jobs is not growing. It's probably declining in real terms. I mean, most people probably saw the reports that just came out a couple of days ago about the unemployment rate nationally is down, and looks like times are good. Jobs are up, except, actual hourly average earnings are going down. And there's this very seemingly contradictory signals as to what's happening with our economy. But the point is that people are struggling, they feel pretty strapped, and they respond. Obviously, the results of the election are people responded very well to people who said, I'm going to hold the line on taxes, or I'm going to cut spending, and so on. And I think there's this general sense that if you ask most people on the street in Maine, well, how are the taxes in Maine? Is Maine a high-tax state, or is Maine, what? I mean, I think most people probably would say something like, oh, yeah, Maine's the highest tax state in the nation. Everybody knows that, right?
Yes. That is a very common misperception. It's one of the myths about Maine taxation. And if you compared 3 or 4 years ago, a group in Washington called Citizens for Tax Justice did an analysis of state tax systems in all of the 50 states and showed the proportion of taxes, proportion of income that people at different incomes pay in all taxes, their property tax, their sales tax, their excess tax, and their income tax. And what that study showed was that if you compare people with incomes of, let us say, for example, $75,000 income, then it's true that Maine's total tax bite is higher for that income group than many states. Because we have a very progressive income tax system, we demand more of people with high incomes than other states do. But if we compare people at what is the median income in Maine, which is roughly $30,000 for a family of four, then Maine is very similar, right in the middle of the states, right in the middle.
And excuse me for interrupting, but you're talking there about how people are taxed not just on income,
That's
but
right.
a combination of their
That's a
income
combination
tax.
of property tax,
Right.
income tax, excise tax,
Mhm.
and sales
Sales
tax.
tax.
All of those combined together. And just to take property tax as an example, we've already suggested that it varies considerably between different communities in Maine. And some communities are more highly taxed than others, and people in those communities feel that acutely. But if you compare the property tax in Maine to New Hampshire, for example, New Hampshire has much higher property taxes. If you compare it to the property taxes in Massachusetts, Massachusetts has much higher property taxes. Example, a few years ago there was a tax cap proposition in Massachusetts called Proposition 2.5, which said that nobody would have to pay property tax greater than 2.5% of the value of their property. The average property tax rate in Maine is just over 1.5% of the value of property. So we're substantially lower than these neighboring states, and yet our governor has told us for 8 years that we are among the highest tax states by selecting the comparison and looking only at the comparison if you take somebody at a high income level in a high property tax town and compare that across other states, rather than looking at somebody who's really in the middle of the situation in Maine.
Okay, so for, again, viewers of this show who may be looking at this in anywhere from Biddeford to Rumford to Portland and any other communities we're on, I don't know what the various property tax rates are in those communities, but the point you're making, Kid, is that for all of my viewers who make $75,000 or more, you're right. You know, you are higher taxed. For any of you who might have less than $75,000 and still be able to afford cable rates and are watching tonight's show, you are less than higher taxed. You're
That's
maybe in the
right
median range.
Right in the middle compared to other
Yeah.
states.
So that makes that means something very significant, though, it seems to me, in terms of what kind of choices we face. If we start from the proposition that we are the highest tax state, then that's going to lead to certain decisions that we have to lower our taxes.
The
But-
problem is whose taxes would get lowered. For example, there's a proposal, as you know, and people generally probably have heard in the news, for a tax cap on property taxes. And the problem with that approach is that it controls everybody's property tax, and it paradoxically gives the most relief to the people who are paying the highest property taxes, which tend to be people who own the property of the highest value. So Boise Cascade, International Paper, SD Warren, and Central Maine Power Company would benefit tremendously from a cap on property taxes and relief generally of property taxes. Out-of-state homeowners, of whom we have a number in this state, out-of-state landowners, commercial businesses, and so on, so that the average homeowner would actually see a smaller piece of that relief. Another way to approach property tax relief is what was known as the circuit breaker, or the Maine Residents Property Tax Relief Program, which was designed and has substantially been cut, but it was designed to give relief to the people whose property tax was out of their ability to pay because they had small incomes and owed a high tax. Might be, for example, an elderly couple that were living in their home on a fixed income, Social Security or something, and lived in a coastal neighborhood that has gone up in value.
Mhm.
Their living spaces remains the same, but suddenly it's worth $200,000. It wasn't that when they built it or whatever,
Mhm.
but now it is. So circuit breaker focuses relief on that particular family
Mhm.
that needs the relief because of low income or moderate income. Whereas what we've done is to cut the circuit breaker program. That's one of the short-term budget fixes of the last couple of years. And I think there's a danger that it could be cut further. And instead, do some kind of across-the-board property tax relief that gives benefits to people who, on balance, really don't
Mhm.
need it so
Mhm.
much.
Mhm. I think that as this book is released, and I think you might want to highlight some of the particular articles written in here, but it seems to me very important to provide an alternative perspective because political memories are kind of short, I think, and a lot of people may have forgotten about the circuit breaker approach to dealing with property tax relief, and people are signing on in droves to this referendum question that you referred to say let's just cap everybody's property taxes, and it's got to be good for us. And I think the point that is trying to be made here is that all solutions are not necessarily good for everybody. They may be good for some people, but not good for other people. And as citizens, we need to know about that, and our legislators need to know about that.
That's one of the points that's made in a couple of different chapters in this book about property tax relief needing to be targeted to the people who really need the relief and the municipalities that really need the relief, and not all municipalities. Another one of the articles is on what are called tax expenditures
Mhm.
or tax breaks or tax loopholes as we commonly know them. And what that article points out is that, for example, corporate income tax has substantially been reduced by something called the investment tax credit. And the article points out that while it was enacted with the idea that it would encourage investment, perhaps from the idea that that would help build jobs, paradoxically, what it has done is seriously cut the amount that we collect from corporations, and it rewards profitable corporations that are doing well. A struggling company that doesn't owe an income tax because it didn't have income has no benefit from the income tax credit. It's only a profitable company that can benefit. And what most of those benefits seem to have gone to is to companies that were, for example, putting in a new paper machine, an investment they were going to make anyway. It doesn't appear that it has caused investments that weren't going to be made. Rewards a profitable company for doing something it was going to do anyway, and unfortunately that usually has the result of decreasing jobs rather than expanding jobs, because a new paper machine is more efficient than the old paper machine, and it's designed to save on labor costs.
Mhm.
Now, it may be a good thing for Maine mills to upgrade and to invest in newer machinery, but it's not necessarily a good thing that some $25 million of state money essentially is, you could say, been given
Being
to these
spent.
being spent in that way.
Yeah. I think the article that you're referring to, Kid, is one of the articles that I've had a chance to try to read ahead because I was curious about this idea of tax breaks, having seen some of this go on, and know that we do need to do things to try to develop industries here that are going to employ people and provide good jobs with good benefits and a decent standard of living for our people. Yet the way in which those decisions are made has been, well, less than scientific, let's say,
Yes.
Less than well thought out, perhaps. I found it interesting that the author of this article talks about these tax breaks as expenditures, that we need to think about this stuff as monies that are being spent, just like we're spending money on any other state program. We're spending this money in terms of, giving to companies or individuals or whatever group of the society, giving them a credit for money they don't have to pay into the state treasury. I found also it sort of interesting, and I'm not sure how many of our viewers would be aware of the relative size of where does the money come from. Our state budget is made up of major component parts of the income tax, the sales tax, and corporate taxes, with a smattering of others.
Right.
Could you just give us a...
Very roughly, out of a $1.6 billion budget, about a third comes from sales tax, about 600 million, another 500 some million from personal income tax, and a very small percent, 5%, from corporate income
Mhm.
tax.
Mhm.
Another substantial amount from excise taxes of various kinds. So the corporate income tax has shrunk as a contributor to the state budget from maybe 15 years ago. It was about 10% of the state income came from corporate income tax. That's down to around 5% now. So
Well, there are, some big decisions going to be made. And I know, this isn't so much addressed in the book, but one of the proposals that Governor-elect King was talking about in the campaign was potentially changing the tax mix so that there would no longer be the personal property tax bill on business equipment. And that would result in a net loss of, I believe, something like $100 million, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
That, there's some unfair aspects of that, and that is discouraging to some businesses to have to pay that property tax on their equipment. But it would need to be offset someplace. And, if you look at the relative size of that, $100 million that's twice what's now being paid in the corporate income tax. I mean, there's no way. I mean, let's be real.
It
It's
does
not
not
gonna happen.
seem likely that the corporate income tax could be expanded to make up that difference.
Mhm.
There are other ways that should be considered, and the article on tax expenditures raises the question, points out that the sales tax right now is on a very narrow base and at a fairly high rate, 6%. That causes a couple of different problems. One problem is that many of us are aware that the economy is moving more and more into the service area and less involved in the sale of manufacture and sale of goods. So as you have a tax system that depends very heavily on a sales tax that is applied only on the exchange sale of goods, then as more economic activity takes place in the area of services, that gets uncaptured by the sales tax. So state government needs continue to grow, but the economy is growing, but more of the economy is taking place in the service sector, which is not subject to tax.
Mhm.
So the suggestion that this author makes is that we should apply sales tax to services. That would bring in new revenue, which theoretically could be used to reduce the rate so that you could apply a 5% or a 4% rate to many more things.
Mhm.
It would be fairer in that it would apply more equally to different kinds of business. The other thing that it would do, it would even out the peaks and valleys that take place in sales tax collections right now. When sales tax depends on the sale of goods, it depends a lot on the purchase of cars,
Right.
refrigerators,
Big
big
ticket
ticket
items,
items that people can put off when there are hard times.
Right.
And when they do that, the state revenue take a plunge,
Right.
as they have in the last 4 years.
At the very time that the
when the need
needs,
is great.
unemployment benefits, state assistance to people who are in crisis, that goes up.
Right.
And revenues go down, and we're in the mess that we've been in. The other thing, of course, that people will say is, well, with the 6% sales tax, we've got people running off to New Hampshire,
Yes.
to make purchases and so on. And I'm sure that, I don't know what the numbers are, but I'm sure that that's true to some extent. Particularly, we're here in York County, we're pretty close, and I'm sure that is the case. So, what the book points out, and what you and your colleagues are going to be arguing some at the legislature and in the public arena, is we need to look more carefully at what our sources of revenue are.
Yeah.
Now, these are, unfortunately, in the way we run political campaigns, these are non-starters in a political campaign. I mean,
it's true. that
people
if
talked
if
about
you breathe-
services and...
If you breathe the word tax, it appears to stop everybody's attention.
Mhm.
They don't want to think beyond that word.
Mhm.
And what we're suggesting is that as citizens, we really need to get used to facing that word.
Mhm.
It will be better for us if we do.
Mhm.
You know, the analogy is frequently made that the two things we can't avoid, death and taxes. And our society has an avoidance of death, which is very costly and very harmful to people, to not really deal with the reality of our mortality. I would suggest that taxes, similarly, it's very costly to look at the particulars about taxes. That just saying, oh, I don't want to think about it because it's a tax, means that we're going to get stuck. Because the people who do think about it have designed a tax system that is going to give more relief to people at the upper end and less relief to people at the bottom. Until working people take a more critical look at the issue of taxation, we're going to suffer more in terms of who bears the burden.
Yeah, that's what I think this really is about, is, who's paying and what are we paying for? And it's not the same thing for just anybody in our society. There are different groups that are asked to chip in at a different level and who have, different needs and different expectations from the society. Kit, the book sort of talks about both where we generate the income, what taxes or fees or, how do we get revenues, and then the other side is, so what are we spending them on and why? And you started to mention a minute ago that our avoidance of the word tax or thought of tax and our sort of quick fix gut, reactions of no taxes is very costly to us. And I wonder if you might talk about a few of the areas in which you see that this avoidance is being very, very costly to us.
Well, let me give the example that I mentioned briefly before, that is in the area of education. I think that as we move into this global competition, which we've not necessarily asked for, but we find ourselves in a world in which companies are engaged in worldwide competition, that the training of our workforce is going to become more and more important. And Maine schools are going to have to spend money on computer equipment and software to give our kids a chance to compete with that high technology kind of world. And right now, the poorer schools are just not able to make that kind of investment. And we all suffer by that. Just because a kid goes to school in Whitefield or some town that has seen an extreme shrinking of their resource base from the lack of state support, doesn't mean that if we don't live there we shouldn't care. Because that kid's going to grow up and he's going to work, travel. In Maine, you don't stay in one place to get a job. If you do, you won't have a job. You've got to travel. And so when I get to retirement age, my Social Security is going to depend upon the earnings and the paying in of kids educated in every town of Maine. So I have a stake in the quality of education in every town. And the property tax increases that were imposed upon the poorer towns in the last 4 years of freezing aid to local education is an example of no taxes on the state level, hidden tax for some people in some towns very much greater.
Yeah.
They were hurt a lot more than they would have been by more modest increases on a more equal.
Right, these costs are going to come back in much bigger ways down the road.
Here's another example,
Okay.
a couple more examples. During the last session, there was discussion of people in nursing homes, which is one of the very significant costs of state government. It's begun to constrain it, it's begun to shrink a little bit, but we have a high proportion of state expenditures going into nursing homes to serve people in nursing homes. Now, the governor's proposal last year, and I'm sure that we'll have to consider this again, is reducing eligibility for nursing homes to the extent of 6,000 or 7,000 people who are currently paid for by the state would no longer be paid for by the state. People who don't have a family member in nursing homes may not think of that as a burden on them. But think about the working family with 2 people in the household out working, making $30,000 a year. And they get a phone call and say, Auntie's not going to be subsidized by the state anymore. You going to come pick her up? How can they do that? They're both out of the house working. oh, are you gonna pay the $40,000 a year nursing home bill? Working families can't do that. And we tend to forget the benefits that state government provides unless we personally are getting them. And we forget that that care of our neighbor who needs nursing home care, or the families who have a child that suffers from a developmental disability, where the state provides a tremendous amount of resources to help that child, or the family member with mental illness. These are things that Maine historically has not walked away from. We have been a compassionate state that have invested a lot of resources in caring for these people. No new taxes mean we're not able to do that. Somebody's going to pick up the bill. And it's going to be a lot of working Maine families who have to take on a burden that they simply don't have the resources to do anymore. There's not a wife staying home ready to take care of auntie or grandma anymore. It's just not. People realize that's not how people's lives are anymore. Most people, 2 people in the household are out working, so they can't do that kind of care anymore.
You know, this, what you're describing is something that's facing people, you know, some of the people that we've dealt with in the textile industry and the apparel industry. You know, we've talked on previous editions of this show a lot about NAFTA, and we've talked about GATT, and, you know, you've referred to global competition that we're all facing. We didn't really ask for, but we clearly are facing now. And one of the things that's going to mean to people, let's just bring it right home here to Maine and to Biddeford, Maine, is we're going to be facing over time an increasing number of people who are going to be dislocated from their jobs because their employment is not going to survive this global competition. We're competing with, you know, wage rates of, you know, 30 cents an hour, maybe 16-hour days in Indonesia of, you know, 16, 15-year-old girls who are in, you know, factories, and that's the way life is there for them. And so without talking about the morality and ethics of that, just the economics of that mean that people in this country, in this state, in this community are going to be losing jobs over time. That's an inevitable consequence. Everybody recognizes it. Yet there has been no, interestingly to me, no response by the society, by the government to say, okay, here's how we're going to take care of, here's how we're going to invest in the people who get displaced. The Senate last week voted in this big showdown vote on GATT to waive the budget rule to allow for the loss of revenues that we're going to take in due to the reduction of tariffs. That they could waive the budget rule to the tune of $30 billion for that, but there wasn't $1 waived to provide retraining money or education money, or whether it's computers or software or subsidizing people who need to go back to school. Those things just aren't factored in. And I mean, you see that on a federal level. It's something that, you know, certainly affects people in our industry, but it's the same phenomena you're talking about here in the state in terms of the state budget, that there are decisions that are being made, that the economics require maybe have to be made, yet no investment for the people who are going to have to pick up the pieces, right?
Right.
We see that same issue here, and your book, one of the papers in the book highlights this, insofar as the retirement system.
Yes.
Viewers may recall a few months ago we had Carl Lennon from the State Employees Association on the show to talk about some of the budget gimmicks that were the last legislature and the last governor put together to try to patch together a budget. And some of those gimmicks had to do with changing and shorting, really, the retirement system.
Yes.
Could you talk to us a little bit about how you think those decisions are going to impact on how that's going to be costly to all of us?
Peter Leslie, who's the investment banker and advisor to the retirement system, who wrote this paper, he was also a member of a commission that was called the Monks Commission to study the state retirement system, makes the point that we, and really our children, are going to have to pay much more in taxes to fund state retirement benefits 30 years from now because of the failure to put the money in that really should be required to fund the benefits that will be drawn in future years. And that each time, and this has happened several times in the last several years, the bill has been put off. Each time that's done, it gets more costly because more interest has to be paid. And what he recommends is that we gradually reduce that underfunding, and he suggests that simply to stay even at the present rate of what is being put in at the present is going to require an addition of $20 million to stay current. To reduce that underfunding, he suggests we begin with an additional $20 million beyond that. So a total of $40 million extra dollars is what he's saying the retirement system really needs for several years to gradually save us much more dollars than that in the long run. Another example of the kind of penny wise, pound foolish kind of thinking, there's a paper on corrections in which it discusses how probation has been cut. Parole was eliminated by statute years ago, and those kinds of alternative sentences have been sharply restricted. And so we've concentrated more and more of our resources into very expensive institutions. And the point made by, in this case, Craig McEwen, who wrote the paper on corrections, is that we are doing this, investing more and more money in corrections institutions at the same time as our crime rate is actually quite modest and coming down.
Yeah, well, that's, political campaign season, crime was, it was crime and taxes that a lot of people campaigned on, and they did a pretty effective job in selling people on the notion that they've got to defend themselves. And
one of the points he made was that television coverage of incidents of crime has gone up dramatically, where victim surveys that sociologists have done over the last 20 years show that actual crime victimization has actually gone down. This is both nationally and here in the state. And then he compares the rate of incarceration per violent offense here in Maine with other New England states, and has had the effect of our investment going up and our incarceration going up, even though we have a very modest crime problem. We might mention California as an example, where they've gone on a prison building binge and are now spending 10% of their state budget on corrections. Meanwhile, their investment in higher education has gone down from what it used to be, about 10%, to closer to 5%. So the positions of investment in higher education and corrections have just about reversed. I think we can ask people in California whether in the long run are they really going to be safer and better off? Are ordinary working people going to be better off with the crippling of an excellent public education system that they used to have? And we need to ask ourselves, we haven't gone as far in that direction. We're better off here now. We can turn it around quicker because the numbers are not so bad.
See, it does seem to me that as we discuss these problems and you put this in the context of California, well, Maine obviously is a lot more manageable. Things aren't as bad. Nothing is as big or as bad as California, Maine, I suppose. But you do have a sense that we have an opportunity to learn some things and maybe do things differently here. And I think that fortunately, your organization, the Maine Center for Economic Policy, is maybe you wouldn't get a hearing in a place like California. Here in Maine, we're small enough that hopefully you'll be able to have an impact and at least get some attention paid to some of the alternative views that you're able to project through this work. And to me, I find that an encouraging thing about Maine and about the work that you're doing. I would hope that in an area like, let's talk about healthcare for a minute, because it's another area in which the book highlights some issues, and it's something that's been talked about here a great deal. It may also be a place where we are about to head down the road of more expensive solutions for the future based on illusory savings now.
Yes. Well, I gave the example of the tremendous investment that the state has placed in nursing homes, and the last governor's proposal was just to make a whole bunch of people not eligible for nursing home care. That was actually rejected by the legislature, but in its place, they introduced a number of ways to try to encourage more care for people in their own homes. The groups representing elders made the case that elderly people in most situations would prefer to be in their own homes if they can get the kind of home health care that they need to be able to stay in their own homes. That actually has been done to a modest degree here in Maine, and the total expenditures on nursing homes has just begun to go down. And the question is whether we're going to have the patience to keep going in that direction, or whether we're suddenly going to lurch in some other direction because there are people within the nursing home industry and some advocates who are concerned that we've gone too far and we're now preventing people who need nursing home care from getting into nursing home. But applying that standard on the basis of, is this person really so sick that the only place that they can be cared for is a nursing home, is perhaps a better way to do it than the standard of your income is too high, we're not going to pay for you, even though we fully realize you don't have the income to take care of yourself, which is the alternative that's been discussed. Other areas in healthcare has grown very fast. And one of the points that's made in the paper by two scholars from the Muskie Institute, Ellen Schneider and Beth Kilbreth, in this area, is that we really need to look at controlling healthcare costs. That Medicaid has gone up at a slower rate than healthcare costs generally, and at a slower rate than other states. But we can't take much comfort in that, because Medicaid as a proportion of the state budget has grown from roughly 15% to 20% in the last 5 years. So it is growing. We do need to get a handle on it, but the suggestion is we need to look at all health care costs. One of the ways in which this works is that if we simply cut off eligibility to some people who depend upon Medicaid right now to pay their hospital bill, for example, it is likely that those people would still go to hospital, get care, not have the ability to pay for it, and it would be passed on to other payers, those of us who are fortunate enough to still have insurance. So by just looking at the state budget, we could save money in the state budget, but drive costs up from all of our pocketbooks in our health insurance bill.
Right.
So that's an example of how we really have to look at a bigger picture than just focusing on the state budget.
Well, Kit, let me ask you how it is that you intend to try to publicize your work, how the Maine Center will try to influence this debate, because it's going to be happening very quickly. We mentioned the shortfall and the tough decisions of the next few months.
Basically, our role is to study these things, lay out proposed alternatives, and make them available to the broadest audience possible. Copies of this book have already, before it came back from the printers, we Xeroxed some and made them available to the transition team, to the new governor, and will be distributed to all members of the legislature. We're also making them available to the public. We are charging $17 for the book because of the printing costs, but we are making sure that it gets into the hands of people like the Maine AFL-CIO and the elder groups and other groups that have an interest in influencing legislation. And I appreciate this opportunity. This is part of getting the word out to people as best we can. We've also been invited to have interviews with newspaper people and stuff like that to try to... What we're looking to do is not simply to provide one set of answers to the budget debate. What we really want to do, and which Frank O'Hara makes the point in his introduction, is to engage more people in a discussion of the real issues rather than just slogans.
Right.
And to encourage people to take that kind of civic responsibility, we could call it, that this is our government, and it matters how our government functions. It can be improved, and we shouldn't simply take the approach of, I don't want to hear about it, that is sometimes deserve.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we would hope to do through the medium of this show and other things is to hopefully encourage people to think that there is some responsibility we have as a community.
Yes.
I mean, a number of things you talked about before really had to do with community responsibilities, and the responsibility goes beyond the election. We've gone through the election. People have now been elected to office, but I would say many of them elected on slogans and on quick sound bites and not in any substantive way dealing with these difficult problems. And so it would, I think this makes a wonderful contribution, hopefully, to a debate that hopefully will be engaged in not just by the legislature, but by citizen groups, whether they're unions or church groups or civic organizations we're all going to be having to face the consequences of the decisions that get made by government leaders, by business leaders, by the power structure in the state. So
may I take advantage of your invitation to say that people can contact us at the Maine Center for Economic Policy. Our telephone number is 622-7381. We have copies of this book, Maine Choices 1995, that we'd be happy to share with people. I'd be happy to answer questions, and I can go to community groups to give talks and engage in debates with people if people would like. Our address is Post Office Box 2422, Augusta 04338. And we really do appreciate this opportunity, but we want to just keep doing more of this kind of conversation as often and as many places around the state that we can.
Good. Well, we hope this makes some contribution. I hope that at least we've been able to highlight here in the short time we've had a few of the issues that are addressed, a few of the decisions that the legislature is going to be needing to make in the next few weeks, and we would appreciate you coming back, Kit, as things go on and the legislature does make some choices. They may not make they may choose to ignore some of the hard choices because you don't lay out any simple answers here.
No,
there aren't such things.
we're not suggesting that there are simple answers. And I want to say that I think that the legislature in the last 4 years has done a remarkably good job. I mean, they get criticized for gimmicks, but they had a wrestle to pull the ends of the thing together.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they did a pretty good job of maintaining the basic services that the state provides in a good way. It's going to get harder now because after going through 4 years of reductions, to find new areas to cut are just not going to be very easy. Mm-hmm. And so we need to take a longer view, and we need to work harder to go after some of the harder things to do than that just weren't feasible a few years ago are going to have to get feasible now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, it will be an interesting year. Everyone agrees on that. And Kit, I want to thank you very much for joining me. Okay,
it was a lot of fun.
And thanks to our viewers for staying tuned through what's the beginning of some difficult choices and some tough issues. We're beyond the election season. It's now the real deal. So. Thank you again for tuning in. We'll be back with more interesting guests as we look at the Maine issues and policies from the point of view of how it's going to impact working people and throughout the state. So thanks very much. Thanks again, Kit, and do come back, viewers. And I think we're now done.
The last thing that we need in this state is more taxes.
Which one?
By any measure, Maine is a high tax state. If you look at our property taxes, they're high. At 6%, our sales tax is among the highest in the nation, and our income tax rates are among the highest in the nation. So the last solution to this problem is taxes. We simply can't afford to raise taxes in this state.
Can we afford tax equity? Is it fair?
Here's what'll happen, Jonathan. Here's
What
the
you're
problem.
proposing
Let's
is a broad-based tax increase for most Maine
No.
citizens.
We're targeting those exemptions that have been given to special interest over the years.
You're talking about accountant services,